So today I'm going to go over a brief and incomplete history and evaluation of various practices and tendencies as they've developed within anarchism as a broad social movement. In order to start this presentation, I think it's important to go over some basic definitions that will be used. I know it's very early in the morning, but I'm going to just be using tons of abstractions. So the sooner I can define my terms, the better, I think. So starting off with that, before we get into the definition of anarchism, which is itself a debate in large part, socialism, that refers to the means of production being held in common and self-managed by communities and or workers directly in some kind of way. Libertarian socialism is referring to a praxis in favor of developing socialism through anti-state, anti-hierarchical, pro-organizational means towards that kind of socialist revolution. Communism is going to refer to socialism, but plus no money, a moneyless, classless, stateless society, as well as means of production held in common and self-managed by people directly, as well as distribution according to needs and abilities. And then communalism is going to refer to the means and the ends of libertarian socialism in tandem with co-federated community assemblies as revolutionary forms to be developed over time, in tandem with communism and something that's controversial to a lot of anarchism, constitutions, bylaws, a conception of non-hierarchical law itself. And what I mean by hierarchy is going to be consistent with Bookchin's conception of hierarchy. It's going to be referring to institutionalized top-down command obedience with ultimate recourse to coercion. And formal organizing and institutions is going to refer to structures with malleable rules, practices, goals designed to go onwards, not necessarily hierarchical, not necessarily non-hierarchical. And mass organizing, as I'm going to be defining it and using it, wants such formal organizations and institutions to spread and be used among common people. So now getting into anarchism, or I should say anarchism versus anarchism in part. So defining anarchism is difficult. There's lots of competing definitions between anarchists and amongst non-anarchists as well. It's hard to find some consensus. One of the least coherent definitions of anarchism just means against the state to a lot of people. And one of the problems with this definition is that there are plenty of hierarchical stateless societies or persons, groups, and movements that are against the state, but in favor of specific kinds of hierarchies. In fact, we know that the first hierarchies didn't have a state initially. So there's definitely an issue there. And there's certain anthropologists who will actually use the term anarchy just to refer to any society without a state. It leads to all sorts of problems and obscuring a lot of different tendencies together. A more coherent definition than just against the state is against hierarchy more broadly. And we get that definition in part even from Kropotkin's encyclopedia article. The problem with this definition is that there are key members and parts of the historical anarchist movement that were actually not fully against hierarchy. And additionally, there are parts of the history of freedom that are distinct from the historical anarchist movement that are also against hierarchy. Although it does make sense for us to have a term for a transhistorical term that encompasses a multiplicity of non-hierarchical societies and anti-hierarchical tendencies, anarchism is also a specific historical tendency. And another problem is that anti-hierarchy is still a mere negative program, what one is against, but not necessarily what one is for. Merely being against hierarchy could include revolutionary, non-revolutionary, even anti-revolutionary persons and tendencies, and a whole array of different things that one is for, and not just what one is against. Now, one of the more coherent definitions of anarchism that is arguably far too coherent for anarchism in a sense. And there's ways to argue against this definition, saying that it's trying to make anarchism way more coherent than it actually was, is to define anarchism as revolutionary, anti-state, usually anti-hierarchical socialism, emerging out of a particular historical tradition. And that is sort of the new anarchist historical definition. And that is going to be a definition I'm going to actually stick closer to than the other ones, because I think it is the best definition despite all of its problems. And an alternative definition to that last one is something like the new anarchist historicist definition, but extended to include some stuff that the historicist anarchist definition excludes, like mutualism, individualism, certain strains of individualism that it excludes, some schools of non-revolutionary anarchism, etc. So a bit more broad, including some stuff that's more on the fringes of the historical anarchist movement, but I think is nonetheless part of it. Now, the organizational branch of anarchism, which encompasses most of anarchism's history, it thinks that mass organizations, formal organizations, are needed for a revolution and a good society. Such organizations are to meet people's needs, to oppose hierarchies, to use mutual aid and direct action, to develop popular movements, to develop a revolution, to develop socialism. Often these mass organizations are either unions or community assemblies. Some other reasons for having formal organizations is they allow us to pool needs, abilities, tools, resources, technology, ideas on multiple scales in such a way that allows people to multiply their actions to achieve various goals worth striving for in regards to problem solving, to economics, to developing communal projects, events, activities, etc. And also formal organizing expands mutual aid within and between communities, enables self-management on multiple scales of existence, and enables a horizontalist way of organizing the interdependence that we factually do have upon each other. In contrast to the organizational, pro-organizational branch of anarchism, there is the insurrectionary, anti-organizational branch of anarchism. And that is opposed to mass anarchist organizations and formal organizations as part of the strategy, and instead favors informal activity in the insurrectionary school in particular, where political violence of some kind is used to inspire insurrections. Also known as insurrectionary anarchism, although one of the problems with framing it as such makes it seem as if social anarchism wasn't insurrectionary, right? It makes it seem as if insurrectionary anarchism has some monopoly on insurrection. But objectively in history, social anarchism has been more insurrectionary, despite not centering insurrection as the major component of strategy or the major component of rhetoric. And both such tendencies have a historical grounding within anarchism. Organizational anarchism being more popular and more successful does not give it a monopoly on anarchism. First off, something interesting to note how the organizational branch of anarchism, which is a broad tendency that includes multiple tendencies, that doesn't necessarily exclude informalist and insurrectionary dimensions, but the anti-organizational approach does exclude formal popular organizational approaches. In this sense, the organizational and social anarchist approach to arriving at stateless socialism without hierarchy already includes some non-organizational means. So when it comes to the question of formal organizing versus informal organizing, a notion of both and already exists within social anarchism, whereas the either or is actually being posed and posited by these various non-social anarchisms. When it comes to strategy and practical activity, these two are opposed on many first-order questions and goals. And a problem for anarchism with a coherent historical definition is that even the most coherent and stringent definition of anarchism that I've provided includes some anti-organizational and non-organizational tendencies. Some major differences within the coherent conception of anarchism, besides the question of just pro-organizational versus anti-organizational, is what is meant by anti-hierarchy, what is meant by hierarchy itself, what are these specific hierarchies, what are their history, how do we oppose them, etc. What forms of freedom should exist in a good society, where should power be, how should the economy be organized, what forms of organization should be used to get towards a good society. Often that's between a conception of radical unionism versus community assemblies, but there's some others as well. What general strategies should be used? How should resources be distributed? In questions of distributive justice, not just questions of how production should be organized. Is dual organizationalism, that is forming specific ideological anarchist organizations as well as popular organizations, is that a good approach? Should anarchists organize with non-anarchists, and if so, how and on what terms, etc. Some people consider this plurality one of anarchism's strengths, and others consider that one of anarchism's weaknesses. And I do think the dialogue between all of those different tendencies is very fruitful and productive, as is revisiting those debates and critically inquiring into one's own positions. Some tendencies and practices, I'm going to argue, are objectively better than others, either generally or in specific contexts, in relationship to developing specific criteria and goals, such as revolution, socialism, freedom, justice, happiness, you name it. So now moving more into some anarchist history after we've done some of that analytical groundwork. Proto-anarchist thought, I'm going to do a little bit of this, but not much. So of course, cross-culturally, there's been a lot of what might be called anarchistic thoughts or practices. Ever since the history of domination developed, there's been a history of resistance to it. There's also a broad history of mutual aid within human history and ecological history. Some precursors to anarchism include various utopian thinkers and groups. Some of those groups being groups like the Diggers and the Levelers, but there's of course many others. Various indigenous social organizational forms that various anarchists were actually aware of to some degree. Proudhon, William Godwin, various radical Enlightenment thinkers, the emergence of the left as a broad tendency. And of course, those radical Enlightenment thinkers were also in part influenced by indigenous American organizational forms, certain radical democracy, common property, etc., usufruct that they were reading from various colonial anthropologists. As problematic as those colonial anthropologists are, of course, they nonetheless would sometimes retain some true information about organizational forms that were radically egalitarian. And of course, there's various Greco-Roman antiquity that's being developed in the Enlightenment as well in regards to recovering democracy. So it's coming from multiple places there. And according to some definitions, some of these proto-anarchists, such as Proudhon, William Godwin, etc., are prior to anarchism as a social movement for revolution. And that social movement for a revolution under the name anarchism really forms in the 1860s, 1870s, rather than this conception of anarchism starting with Proudhon. This really focuses more on the social movement itself under that name. Nonetheless, I do think it's arguable that Proudhon is part of that overall tendency as well, and there's ways to mix a definition of that new historical definition in such a way that includes some of these kind of proto-anarchistic thoughts as crucial to that movement. And it's arguable that there's enough Proudhonists during the First International that it is fair to include them under this conception of anarchism as a social movement. So now moving more into the history of classical anarchism. Just a quick note, this will not be an exhaustive history. Far from it. I have far too little time for that, and I don't know it all. And I'm intentionally going to be leaving out many details, many key persons, many dimensions of the anarchist movement, so I can focus on some features. And just for example, I'm not going to be mentioning the Haymarket Affair or Sacco and Vanzetti, not because that's not very important, just so I can talk about some stuff that gets even less coverage than that. And I'm not going to be mentioning the alphabet soup of different organizations, although that stuff's really important to look up, and I highly recommend people do, and I'll give some sources at the end for people to do so they can look into specific concrete anarchist groups in history. And also it's important to note that anarchist history is an evolving study. Some of what I say will need to be revised as I find new info and as new info emerges. Right now, we're in kind of a golden age of finding out new information about the historical anarchist movement because of new translations being made available at the most intense rate they ever have been. So first, going into the First International, this is where the beginning of anarchism happened as a revolutionary social movement. It starts in this international workers movement, this international socialist movement, and you have this schism between anarchists and Marxists, and this schism was over the means through which socialism should be achieved. Anarchists advocated for at least an anti-state revolutionary means towards socialism, whereas Marxists were in favor of developing a state, a revolutionary state after quashing the old one, that would then dissolve into socialism and communism after this period of transition. Anarchists largely correctly predicted the failures of state approaches to socialism, both reformist ones and revolutionary ones that decided to use, or that were in favor of using the state to try to achieve socialism. Anarchism started as an international social movement, and it spread transnationally through conscious propagation and movement of anarchists between various countries, cross borders, anarchist ideas and anarchist practices spreading with them. Anarchism, of course, also propagated as anarchists would get kicked out of various countries that they spread anarchism within, as they would get targeted by the authorities. The movement was very multilingual from the beginning, and it moves to every continent relatively soon after its beginnings as a movement. One thing to note is the first internationals between the 1860s, 1870s. The Paris Commune emerges in 1871. And here we have a revolutionary movement, relatively decentralist, informed in significant part by anarchistic ideas and practices and anarchist ideas and practices, but also many other tendencies as well. And it was critiqued by both anarchists and Marxists in various directions. 1880s to 1890s, the anarchist movement is having some trouble institutionalizing itself in any meaningful way outside of its own circles. There are communitarian anarchistic projects emerging during this time, and anarchist involvement in the labor movement. Propaganda of the deed, which is that kind of insurrectionary tendency of trying to inspire an insurrection through outrageous, violent political acts targeted against various exploiters and oppressors. And informalist, non-organizational, anti-organizational tendencies, those are a significant part of the anarchist movement at this time. And a lack of sufficient organization within the anarchist movement and winds up separating anarchists from common people and common people from anarchists. And that dynamic helps lead to the anarchist movement being vulnerable to repression. And it got pretty heavily repressed at that period of time internationally. And many who were once in favor of more insurrectionary tendencies, such as propaganda of the deed, went on to change their praxis. And some examples of people who did that includes Berkman and Goldman, of course, who changed their praxis from more of an insurrectionary approach to one that was more pro-organizational as they developed their thoughts. But also Malatesta and Kropotkin, despite not being traditional insurrectionary anarchists, if you will, they had very significant strategy shifts from the 1870s onwards, as they wound up seeing the effects of these kind of informal tendencies, the way that separated the anarchist movement from common people. Despite neither of them being crude insurrectionary anarchists, they're also moving away from various propaganda of the deed-esque ideas and practices that they were in favor of at certain points. Despite anarchism not being hegemonically communist, communism starts to become the dominant economic orientation of most anarchists shortly after the First International. Prior to that, they were in favor of labor vouchers, if not communism. But shortly after the First International, communism becomes the norm within anarchism. Although, once again, not absolutely exhaustively encompassing every anarchist or every social anarchist. This becomes the case really early on in that movement. Then we have the Syndicalist period, and this is mainly from the mid-1890s to 1920s, but it also goes beyond in some places, notably Spain, of course, which is an exception at that time in many regards. So syndicalism becomes the dominant tendency, and it was developed at the First International in large part, and expands upon earlier notions of unionism as a means towards revolution. Syndicalism is in favor of mass organization via unions that organize horizontally and democratically, that use direct action, trying to aim towards a general strike, expropriation, revolution, and socialism. The syndicalist tendency draws a radical divide between pro-organizational and anti-organizational anarchists. Additionally, syndicalism draws a line between a syndicalist strategy and other pro-organizational strategies that aren't syndicalism, people who thought organizing reconstructive and oppositional politics outside of the point of production made the most sense or made even just as much sense as syndicalism at the time. Syndicalism becomes a mass movement with millions of people across continents, and this is mainly outside of Europe. It's important to note that not everybody in a syndicalist union was necessarily an ideological anarchist, but nonetheless, they were part of this broader anarchist movement using practices that developed out of anarchism in large part. Anarchism became the dominant socialist worldview globally up until Bolshevism took its place as well. According to Syndicalism, the revolutionary subject is the working class through their activity at the point of production. And depending on how this is defined and thought out, this could leave out peasants, many disabled people, unemployed people, unemployable people, houseless people, people doing unwaged reproductive labor, self-employed, etc. And this can leave out a lot of oppositional and reconstructive politics in other spheres than production. Depending on how this is all thought out, there's some syndicalists who have a lot more nuance and some that are more orthodox in these respects and reductionist. Syndicalism developed a popularized anarchist practice that uses formal collective decision-making processes, institutionalized direct democracy, has general assemblies of members, it has committees, it has mandated and recallable councils and delegates, it has rules, it uses federalism, ways of organizing together between various groups that still maintains policy-making power being retained by local general assemblies of unions. And it additionally has the separation between policy-making power and administration within these unions. And it does direct action at the point of production. It puts socialist and anarchist ideas into practice en masse, and it helps lend a hand to multiple revolutions and is central to, of course, the Anarcho-Syndicalist revolution in Spain. There's also an important position that develops during this period of time that I think is worth noting, because I think it in part answers a lot of questions about a lot of schisms around syndicalism. There is a pro-syndicalist, non-syndicalism approach. And that was kind of advocated by anarchists like Malatesta, who warned that syndicalism should only be a means towards the revolution and not an ends, and not the means to a revolution. And he also warns of the potential of syndicalism slipping into mere reformism without a conscious anarchist movement that is interfacing with radical unions. And despite all of this, Malatesta is in favor of syndicalist practices, but was not a syndicalist as such, and is often cynically quoted by people who are a specific kind of anti-syndicalist as well. However, it's important to note that Malatesta did think that radical unionism during the period of syndicalism was the major way that we should develop socialism, despite him not being a syndicalist. So then there's communalist anarchism during the syndicalist period. And despite this being a minority tendency in anarchism during the height of syndicalism to the end of the classical anarchist movement in 1940, communalist anarchism is present near fully, mainly, or partially in the first Zapatista revolution, the Free Territory Revolution, the Shinmin Prefecture Revolution, as well as the peasant communes in Anarcho-Syndicalist Spain. And my thesis is that this is not a coincidence. Communal associations are particularly practical and ethical mass organizations at the point of community. They provide various strategic openings and flexibility. Community assemblies can organize reconstructive and oppositional politics at points of extraction, production, reproduction of daily life, distribution, consumption, community life more broadly. They have the potential to reach more people than syndicalism. They have a less narrow conception of who can participate and where participation makes strategic sense. Additionally, I would argue that communal self-management is needed for self-management to exist on every scale. And given that anarchism and libertarian socialism is often being argued from a certain freedom ethic in favor of the freedom of each and all within the context of a free community, that this is a necessary extension of self-management on the community sphere. Without that, you have decision-making power relatively privatized over and above communities in various ways. And on top of being significant parts of major anarchistic revolutions during the classical anarchist period, communal assemblies and various communitarian anarchist projects were also part of this time period, despite playing a lesser role in the anarchist movement compared to syndicalism. And it's also important to note that in the beginning of the anarchist movement, communalism was often advocated in various ways by people like Kropotkin as the major kind of revolutionary form, an organizational form that should exist post-revolution as well, despite, of course, Kropotkin being in favor of varied kinds of organization, not reducible to communal assemblies, to say the least. Additionally, there's individualist anarchism during the Syndicalist period and the end of classical anarchism. Some of it integrated into social anarchism or otherwise existed on the fringes of it. Some propaganda of the deed activities continued. Outside of that, there was a retreat into the personal and into isolated projects on the fringes of society. Various individualist, communitarian, pacifist dropout tendencies emerge. There's a retreat inwards that does develop actually some really interesting anarchist pedagogy, but the revolutionary project falls to the wayside along with outward facing goals within such tendencies. There's an emphasis also on individual psychology and lifestyle choices that takes over the revolutionary project within many individualist circles. This was a really small part of anarchism compared to the revolutionary socialist, organizationalist, mass anarchism, but it's still significant to note some of such tendencies get written off as non-anarchist proper by the narrow historicist definition of anarchism. Ironically, the revolutionary mass social anarchism, despite being nowhere near reduced to insurrection in terms of strategy or rhetoric, of course, was in practice objectively more insurrectionary than insurrectionary anarchism. It objectively reached more people, helped more people, found ways to organize consistent with anti-hierarchical principles, spawned a few revolutions as well. However, for all of its successes compared to a very, very unsuccessful movement such as anti-organizational anarchism or state approaches to socialism, anarchism has, of course, not lived up to its potential. And it's important to note that anarchism had to become more anti-hierarchical over time. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, anarchism begins to blossom in a more full but not perfect way to generally be in favor of gender equality and anti-racism and anti-nationalism. Although not always perfect on these fronts or any fronts, anarchism was extremely historically progressive in these fields compared with other tendencies. As anarchism develops, patriarchal and anti-Semitic dimensions within anarchism that were more popular in the beginning become less popular than they were. And women and Jews become significant parts of the anarchist movement. Anarchist unions and organizations were based on full formal equality and participation of all, regardless of gender, nationality, racial prerequisites, etc. Despite advances within anarchism in this time period compared to its founding, there were still significant expectations about, for example, what work women should do within the anarchist movement. Anarchist theories of gender liberation and free love become significant, but still controversial. As anarchism emerged out of its infancy, anarchism starts to expand beyond anti-capitalism and anti-statism into a less reductionist viewpoint that sees issues of hierarchy more broadly. And just noting some of those revolutions I quickly glossed over earlier, when looking at anarchist revolutions in the pre-1940s periods, there's several examples. There's the first Zapatista revolution of the Morelos Commune, primarily rooted in communal assemblies and common land, which lasted from 1913 to 1917. There's the Free Territory Revolution in Ukraine from 1918 to 1921. The Free Territory had millions of people organized politically, economically through communal assemblies and workers' councils. There's the lesser known Shinmin Prefecture, which learned a lot from the Free Territory and from platformism, which was a tendency that emerged that was critiquing the anarchist movement at the time, specifically learning from the experience of the Ukrainian anarchists and developed by them. And the Shinmin Prefecture, which got to learn from that, was from 1929 to 1931. And it was in Manchuria, organized through community assemblies and committees, and it had around 2 million people and had various communistic dimensions economically as well. Additionally, there's of course Anarcho-Syndicalist Spain in 1936 that had millions of people and was primarily rooted in socialized but non-communal economic forms, although there were communal and communized economics in the more agrarian regions, as well as various communistic features of the workers' collectives, such as the family check, which would give people free necessities. And then the fall of classical anarchism. National and international police repression, fighting wars on multiple fronts without sufficient support in various revolutionary contexts, the increase of Bolshevik tendencies in the socialist and labor movements after World War I in particular, lack of sufficiently organized anarchist movement, mistakes the anarchist movement made, all of this kind of culminated in the destruction of the movement as we know it. Syndicalism became a less viable strategy as well as unions became defanged and integrated into capitalism or otherwise repressed. At this point, 1940, anarchism becomes relatively dormant internationally and was largely forced underground, although there are exceptions to that. So now going into the post-40s period, I'm not going to be as chronological or as focused on this, but I am going to kind of give some kind of overview of some of the pros and cons I see emerging after the 1940s. This includes a reinvigorated communalism, which is, libertarian communism, plus the means and ends of co-federated community assemblies with constitutions. And some communalism defines itself outside of anarchism, of course, but nonetheless, it branched off from anarchism and shares a lot in common with it. And depending on how you define either term, it's potentially within the domain of anarchism, but what's much more interesting than whether or not communalism is anarchism or not is, or even what anarchism is what are the actual practices that we should be developing, of course. And another important tendency emerging out of the post-1940s period is a specifismo, which refers to a practice that involves ideologically specific libertarian socialist groups that spread libertarian socialist practices in social movements and in popular organizations that they join or help. This is done through demonstration and persuasion and in coordinated ways. Especifismo is further distinguished from platformism, for example, which is another kind of dual organizationalism, through one, not adhering to everything in the original platform, which was written in a specific historical and military context. Two, strategic unity rather than mere tactical unity. And three, a more diverse set of options for what kind of popular organizations they engage with. And for example, a lot of the original dual organizationalism was developed specifically to interface with syndicalist unions and workers' councils, whereas especifismo has developed its own practice that is interfaced with community assemblies and various other kinds of groups organizing outside of the point of production. And we see the emergence of an even fuller understanding of being against hierarchy and not just being against capitalism in the state. We see reinvigorated feminist, ecological, queer liberation, and anti-racist theories and practices within post-40s anarchism. We see two new large-scale, predominantly communalist revolutions, the Neo-Zapatista Revolution and Rojava. We see things like community assemblies in Sharon, popular assemblies in Oaxaca, popular assemblies in southern Turkey, etc. We see international syndicalism is nowhere near as grand as it used to be, but it still exists, of course. And significant anarchist presence exists in left social movements globally. Many assembly projects, mutual aid projects, direct action projects, informed by anarchism and helped by anarchists. And anybody who's been on the ground in social movements knows that anarchists are a large part of such movements, at least of people who are very active and militant. And some of the cons of post-1940s anarchism is outside of some tendencies, there's a general failure to recapture the best parts of classical anarchism and even some of the minimal necessary features thereof. And then build upon them, of course, too, because those minimum dimensions aren't sufficient. Those are some very minimal necessary starting places, like should we form popular organizations of some kind to lead to socialism? Even a question like that, depending on the anarchist community and circles one is in, especially within the United States, that might be very controversial even, which is phenomenal. There's a resurgence of anti-organizational anarchism, particularly in the United States, but also in other parts of the world. Various anarchisms emerge that go so far outside of the bounds of the new historicist definition of anarchism to the point where they're explicitly anti-socialist. And that starts existing, once again, to various degrees within the United States and the rest of the world. There's a subculturalization of anarchism, an additional subculturalization, I should say, that brought with it some very rich subcultures, but it also tended towards an inward focus. When anarchism becomes separated from people outside of niche subcultures, that's an issue, to say the least. That leads to the same problem of anarchism being separated from common people, which, if anybody reads any counterinsurgency manual, that is a key goal of counterinsurgency, is to separate the revolutionary movement from common people. A de-emphasis on class and capitalism in the state has also happened within anarchism, a kind of overcorrection to overly reducing social problems to class, capitalism in the state. And organizational anarchism post-1940 has not been able to find as much of an organizational foothold via syndicalism, in part because of changing conditions that make syndicalism more difficult. Once again, repression of radical unions, multiple waves of Red Scares, pragmatic unions being very reformist and that being a common tendency. There's also hierarchical common unionism with its own hierarchical structures as opposed to more democratic structures. There's also less concentrated workplaces depending on where you are in the world, and all of that makes syndicalism more difficult. And a communalist practice is sometimes used, but is still relatively underused, with some very notable exceptions, of course, Rojava and Zapatista, some other associations in Latin America and far beyond, of course, intercontinentally. As far as the anarchist movement in the United States, it includes tendencies that are not only incompatible with each other, but have been part of a 100+ year conflict with multi-decade long iterations thereof. And some closing thoughts. This is all going to be very opinionated, not that the other stuff wasn't. One is that revolutions emerge from libertarian socialist practices and tendencies rather than vague anarchism. Additionally, problematize anarchism. Pro-organizationalists and anti-organizationalists have some claim to anarchism, despite pro-organizational anarchism being most of its history and being that which led to most of its victories. However, many contemporary anti-organizationalists are against socialism and are therefore not anarchists according to the historical definition of anarchism I've been using. The lower common denominator between pro-organizational and anti-organizational anarchism is no org at all. And given that a coherent pro-organizational position is that organizations are merely necessary but not sufficient for revolution, given that anti-organizational approaches see organizations as non-productive or counterproductive or even unethical, the two tendencies don't get along ideologically and practically. Socialism itself must have institutions, and the development thereof is best done in part through popular collective power, ways of deliberating, deciding, and taking action together, and ultimately prefiguring institutions. And additionally, the extension of principles of freedom for all must be self-management of all, including on the community scale. Communalism generally makes the most sense as a practical mass revolutionary form compared to syndicalism. However, syndicalism still makes sense as a means towards the revolution, distinct from the means towards the revolution, especially within specific contexts. As for example, industrial context with concentrated workplaces, high degree of class consciousness, etc., various openings potentially there. Communalism is needed for that self-management on every scale, and it also allows for oppositional and reconstructive politics at every possible point of production, consumption, distribution, reproduction, extraction, community life, intercommunal life. And I would additionally argue that libertarian socialism makes the most sense as a big tent rather than anarchism, because it excludes certain incoherent parts of anarchism that have a legitimate claim to anarchism, by the way, even according to the new anarchist historicist definition, while libertarian socialism also includes various non-anarchist tendencies that share anti-hierarchical, pro-organizational, pro-socialist revolutionary praxis. It's important to note that anarchism is a specific tendency and not the entire history of freedom. We should be remixing the best features of anarchism with the best features of other adjacent tendencies, other sibling tendencies, cousin tendencies, to make our practices more relevant and more effective and more ethical for the context we're within. Additionally, organizational dualism, specifically especificismo, is desirable to help build such a movement. That is, we need to build ideologically specific libertarian socialist groups that work to develop and join groups to spread libertarian socialist practices by persuasion and demonstration. And of course, we additionally need to develop social movements and popular organizations, especially but not limited to community assemblies, united around processes and practices of horizontalist democracy, mutual aid, direct action, and co-federation. And that concludes this spiel. And some sources I have used for it include Anarchism and Syndicalism in the Colonial and Post-Colonial World by Vanderwalt, ABCs of Anarchism by Berkman, Memoirs of a Revolutionary by Victor Serge, We Do Not Fear Anarchy, We Invoke It by Graham, The Anarchist FAQ by McKay, Social Anarchism versus Lifestyle Anarchism by Bookchin, Anarchism in Latin America by Rama, No Gods, No Masters documentary by Ramonet, Mujeres Libres, the book by Acklesberg, Social Anarchism and Organization by Farge, and The Communalist Project by Bookchin. I will post those in the chat so people can check out those sources and develop a better understanding of anarchist history, and hopefully, more importantly, develop the best parts of anarchist practices in whatever context they're within.
Anyone want to get a stack? We use the asterisk generally. Good advice, Diego. So we got Harrison and Damien on stack here.
Also, should we do some breakout groups before Q&A or after some slight Q&A stuff? What do people think? Or should we just do full Q&A? Who knows? Well, we'll get some questions first and maybe do some breakout groups and then rejoin for some last questions. Who knows? Who was first? Harrison.
Not even a question. I just want to say that was a fucking awesome presentation. Love you, Phil. Keep on keeping on. Keep kicking ass today.
Thank you. Love you as well. Let's dialogue soon.
I think Damien was next, and then Toby.
Hey Phil, I also want to say great presentation. I wanted to ask something. I've been reading a lot about the Paris Commune. It's one of my favorite subjects, and the guy I'm reading is pretty like explicitly Marxist in that sense, and he said that the Blanquists, the proto-Leninists, were like a majority in the commune, and I feel like that's a little bit dodgy. I wanted to know if that was actually like that, if you know if it was actually like that or not.
I have not studied the Paris Commune enough to feel comfortable making a statement in regards to that. I would just note that there are significant enough anarchists, Proudhonists, etc. tendencies that were involved in that, and other radical left tendencies as well that have emerged. And there's a lot of course, just popular, it's a popular movement, right? So not all the people involved are necessarily going to be ideologically specific in that kind of way and use those kind of labels. But we would want to look at the ideological composition of people who do have those ideological views. That is an important thing to look at. But if I'm not mistaken, most people in the Paris Commune were not Blanquists because they were, common people, because it was a popular enough movement within Paris, right?
Right, thank you.
And Toby.
Hey, thanks. That was really good. Just quickly, I wondered what your opinion is, because I've seen somewhere that some anarchists believe that majority, I don't know the word exactly for it, but majority votes, they disagree with the principle of it and say it's like authoritarian. I don't know. Obviously, don't know if that's true, but what's your opinion on it?
That's a great question. So one thing to first note is actually the historical anarchist movement used majority decisions instead of consensus in any meaningfully large-scale group. This is true in ideologically specific anarchist groups and within syndicalist unions and other kinds of groups. So it's kind of ahistorical to project consensus and unanimity as the only way things were done. Often the kind of anarchist decision making would be to see if there is full agreement, and then if there isn't, to then find a way to move onwards. And in regards to the notion that majority decision is inherently authoritarian, I think the truth is we have to look at the insufficiency of democracy, for example, right? So is it possible for a majority to decide something that arbitrarily limits the rights of persons? Yes. Is it possible for majorities to decide to abolish democracy and to create a ruling class? Yes, majorities can do that, right? So majority decision is insufficient. However, some kind of self-management of decisions, some kind of democracy is necessary for people to have meaningful self-governance and self-management. So what we need to do really is find out what would be the different qualifiers that could round out majority decision-making to make it coherent. And some of those are a broader non-hierarchical constitution and structure, various individual rights. So majorities should not have the right to arbitrarily limit the freedoms of persons, right? There should be certain freedoms that are guaranteed for people nonetheless. And those are just some examples of various qualifiers that can round out majority decisions. I would note that majority decision-making as a threshold is extremely important as opposed to absolute unanimity for multiple reasons. Unanimity as an absolute decision-making process enables any one individual to veto any decision. That means one bad faith actor, one person who's ignorant, one person who's a cop infiltrating a movement can bring everything to a standstill with that. And when we're talking about confederations in particular that are using that, that becomes an extreme issue, because now one person can veto something within a group, which will veto everything for the entire confederation. And that gives every single person way too much power over collective decisions. That being said, various kinds of groups might make sense with unanimity, especially smaller groups that can make more sense with that. That being said, majority decision-making doesn't necessarily inhibit the participatory decisions of persons. You can have majority decisions within free participation of people. So for example, a group could make a decision to for example, build a community garden in a specific space instead of some other kind of project or some art installation in a specific place where you can't have both at the same time for some reason. That might be a decision that's made by majority that doesn't coerce any individual to do any activity they don't want to do. It just enables collectives to make collective decisions. And there's nothing inherent in collectives making collective decisions through majority that necessarily inhibits any individual freedoms. So you can have majority decision within free association of persons. And that's really important as a way of rounding out majority decisions.
So we've got Ben, Roberto, and George on stack, and I had suggested maybe closing it out after that and doing some breakouts. Sounds like folks want to do that. So I want to point out too, it's at least judging by the names, it seems like it's a lot of dudes up in the stack. Just pointing that out.
I'm happy to hold if we want a progressive stack too.
I think we can keep going. I just wanted to point it out. And...
Okay. Yeah. I often like get into kind of one of these like argumentative like pit holes of like a system of governance needs to be able to justify its existence and like defend itself, and if it can't do that, then it like doesn't necessarily deserve to be like the system of governance. It's usually like with liberals who are critiquing things like anarchism. And I try to point to things like Rojava and the Zapatistas, and they often will say, well, oh, that's like at a small scale, it wouldn't work like on a larger scale and stuff. What would you say to people making those kinds of arguments?
Well, I mean, if they consider millions small scale, they consider millions small scale, and they can have those opinions. But ultimately, those are large scale enough to, I think, show that the basics of self-governance on large scales does work, and works rather well for all of the limits thereof, because there are extreme limits we could look at in Rojava and in Neo-Zapatista region as well. But yeah, I'd point out the overwhelming scale of those groups and how it seems totally feasible that that could be scaled up in multiple directions. But, you know, that's not going to convince everybody. And also point out, like, one thing to note is the historical examples and current examples that we have to go on are not necessarily the limits of what's possible. Those are just what have developed. So it's possible for change to exist beyond what has already existed in history as well. And I think that has to be part of the argument that libertarian socialists and anarchists are going to have to make. We have a good historical evidence to rely on to show that this stuff is possible and feasible. But we also have a duty in the future to show how this stuff could develop on even larger scales as well, because we have to also be honest about the limits of anarchism and the fact that even though anarchism and libertarian socialism have existed in popularized ways amongst millions of people in various contexts, that it still has not achieved global revolution. But it seems totally feasible that a bunch of different building blocks of millions of people could do similar kinds of things. There's nothing inherent in human nature that stops that, to say the least.
How about we do Laura, Roberto, George, and then break?
Sounds good.
Hey, Phil. So first of all, great lecture, very, very informative and interesting. So I just had some general questions of things that I hear that are kind of like in opposition to an anarchist or communalist approach, as opposed to something that is more structured and centralized. So my first question is the issue of if there is some sort of crisis, right? There's always the question of how can you mobilize things quickly enough in response to a crisis? And the other question is in terms of if someone, let's say, was rejected by their community, the idea of there being no sort of like social safety net for those people, that they would have to depend on maybe being accepted into another community, or how would you respond to things like that?
So when it comes to decisions in crisis, there's immediate mandate and recall as a potential lever that can be pulled to switch the course of things within specific communities. Although it is true that the nature of a democratic decision-making process has a degree of slowness to it. And that's an important part of it. People can construct a bunch of disaster scenarios where you have to sacrifice one part of a gestalt that you're trying to advocate for, right? Like, let's say you're trying to advocate for 5 different practices, and someone constructs a disaster scenario, that hypothetical or real, often hypothetical, where there is no way to answer the question without sacrificing one of those gestalts, right? So people might pose that to you, and that might even be a real situation that happens at times. And when that does, there's better and worse ways to answer those disaster scenarios, to say the least. But nonetheless, I would just note the nature of what's happening, which is that you're advocating for 5 different things at once. And they're saying, well, what if it's impossible for those 5 different things to happen and only 4 of them can happen? Then what? Or something like that. And in those kind of contexts, ultimately you have to explain you're advocating for this fuller gestalt, that the disaster scenario is basically saying can't exist because of what's being posed. So within the disaster scenario that's being set up is basically, well, which principle will you sacrifice in this specific context, which you have to know a lot of relevant variables to even find out how to do that, to say the least. But I would note that in general, there is a way to do speedy decisions through immediate mandate and recall and emergency decisions. For example, assemblies can have a situation where they meet up every week, every 2 weeks, every 3 weeks, every month, but then have an emergency situation where under certain contexts, people can call for an assembly within 24 hours or something to make it so things can speed up. So those kind of emergency provisions can exist to deal with those kind of situations. And what was the other part of your question as well?
The other part of the question had to do with what happens if you have someone that is basically rejected by their community for some reason. You know, the fear of there not being any sort of overarching social safety net, that they would have to be dependent on another community's kindness to let them in. How would you deal with that sort of situation?
Yeah, so I would look at what Kropotkin wrote in regards to that. He says how necessities should never be deprived from people, even in those kind of situations, basically. Or almost never, to say the least. He poses one example where it's like a disaster scenario where someone's going to starve no matter what or something because some people are not helping and they're being like parasitic upon some other group, and the group is saying, we don't want you in our association, and there's not enough to go around, and then how do you deal with that dilemma? But he's very in favor of making it so that's never the case through not having a context of that degree of scarcity. So you can always have a safety net of free necessities for all, unconditional, and so that's what needs to be developed, is that kind of cornucopia to make it so there's enough stuff to go around. So even if somebody is, for example, in a worst case scenario, banished from some particular communal association, they still have their necessities met while they're going somewhere else. And the idea is to have a mosaic of so many different communities and collectives that people can find somewhere to join if that's the case, no matter what. So the idea is to have multiple communal associations and not just one or not just two, but to have a mosaic of thousands upon thousands upon thousands of them, and to have free necessities for all as a baseline.
So Roberto and George, I think, are next, and then we can break.
Yes, I would like to point out that one of the reasons that I developed my seminar on indigenous values versus capitalist values is because I noticed that a lot of groups that are all anarchist and socialist are unclear about that difference between their values and capitalist values, and sometimes they include capitalist values unconsciously, which includes things like individualism. And as a result, their groups are weakened, and eventually some of them fall apart. So my thoughts were that we really need to make it clear the difference between these the kinds of values that we're facing under capitalism and what kind of values we would like under communalism. But we would also have to go through a process of decolonizing our thinking, because so many of us carry around capitalist values unconsciously, and you have to make them conscious. You probably need help doing that. Most of you can't do it by yourself, but you need help figuring that out. And that's why I developed the seminars, because I think it provides some clarity on how to look at this different sets of values and see which ones you're still carrying around in your own mind, in your own thinking. And I think that's what's missing to a large extent from a lot of movements, leftists, anarchists, communists, whatever, is that there's not a real clarity on the values that we're operating from.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of that. I think also that there's been a degree of whitewashing to the degree to which anarchism has been influenced by American indigenous practices, indirectly often or directly in certain regards. And yeah, definitely there's a need to interrogate value systems and how people might bring the old world into the shell of the new, if you will. And we need to always be developing those to make sure that we are able to be ethical and effective in our specific contexts to do the good.
I think George is the last person on Stack.
Hello, everyone. Hello from Greece. Congratulations, Phil. I really enjoyed your speech. There are, however, two problems that I think no one can surpass, although a lot of people, even in this intensive, think they can. The first one has to do with violence or non-violence against the state. And the second one has to do with how does one bring down the state. I would like you to comment on this if you have any idea, and maybe provide some new theory, if you have read some new theories from the viewpoint of the anarchist or other ideas on how the state could be brought down or how it functions. I would like a critique on the state, not a Marxist one, if you have read any new critiques. Thank you.
Well, first for the violence, non-violence question, the question is, what is a good standard of when violence is potentially ethical, right? And I think absolute pacifism fails, and I think most tendencies that try to come up with an answer to that fail pretty heavily. So I'd advocate for a conception of self-defense and defense of others, a non-hierarchical conception of the boundaries of duties and freedoms, through which we develop a standard of where self-defense and defense of others is ethical. In regards to when it's effective or whatnot, or ethical in a specific context, that's going to need to be contextual. You're going to need to look at specific variables. I think that libertarian socialism and communalism, they advocate for an array of different practices, and it actually doesn't exhaustively answer those kinds of things because it's really a tool set, if you will, a methodology of sorts that people can then take and then develop in their specific context to actually deal with these kinds of problems. So it doesn't exhaustively answer all of those questions because that's actually for people to answer themselves as they use certain kinds of practices together to achieve various goals in their contexts. So as far as any like encompassing answer to that, we need to look at specific conditions for both of those questions about like when would something be considered legitimate self-defense abstractly, and then when is that effective, right? Because something can be like rightful self-defense that is strategically really stupid and just winds up harming oneself or other people too, even though one's ethically right in some abstract way, right? Like they're in the right in some sense, potentially. That doesn't necessarily mean that's going to work or be effective and actually lead to something positive. So we need to interrogate that as well. It's not enough to just be right. And if we don't combine a conception of self-defense with a strong ethics, that goes terrible places really soon. As far as how to bring down the state, I can only give some kind of vague general answer to that, unless we're talking about how to bring down a specific state in some specific context, at which time I will be probably ignorant of the relevant variables I'm going to need to know, unless I've studied that to actually give a meaningful answer. But I'd say something like a broad communalist dual power is what I'd advocate as the major keystone way to do that, although there's other ways to bring down a state, and not always of being against a state or overthrowing one necessarily lead to something positive or something even better. There's ways to overthrow a state and create something worse as well, right? But when it comes to overthrowing the state and replacing it with something positive, I'd say it's a development of meeting people's needs, decentralizing power overall, creating various kinds of organizational forms that you prefigure as the kind of social relations and governance that we want to see in the future as much as we can in the present, combine that with popular education, and then multiply all of that strategically and effectively in specific contexts within the framework of certain minimal ethical practices. That would be my overall argument for a strategy. That would have to be co-federated along larger scales than merely local, as important as local projects are.
I know I said we'd take George and we'd do the breakouts, but then I threw myself on the stack. I have a quick question if I could, Phil. And then breakouts. My question is about the kind of like culture of pluralism and relativism that I think is kind of been taken up in especially the North American anarchist milieu, but other places as well in the last 30, 40 years. And do you see things like, you know, David Graeber, I think about his valorization of the Zapatista slogan, one no, many yeses, and other kind of like relativistic arguments about, you know, there's multiple ways of knowing. Not that's an inherently, I guess, relativistic thing, but I think it often gets brought up in a very relativistic way. Like there's, you know, you have your truth, I have my truth, this kind of almost extreme individualism. Curious how you would answer these from a directly democratic standpoint, because I think these are some of the arguments that led Bookchin to break with anarchism. And frankly, I see quite clearly why, because I think that most anarchists do not believe in democracy when you really push it. So I'm curious how you would answer these things, and yeah, pluralism and I guess relativism, those issues.
Yeah, so I would agree that those are issues in contemporary anarchism to absurd degrees. And that is in part why I advocated at the end of this that instead of anarchism as a big tent, it makes sense for libertarian socialism as a big tent, because it's a broader tendency that excludes those more incoherent parts of anarchism. Although it has its own pluralism within it still, of course, it's a more coherent pluralism. And it additionally includes various tendencies that might not be anarchist per se, but agree with the basic practices of direct action, direct democracy, mutual aid, free association, anti-hierarchy, pro-organization, pro-revolution, all of those different features. So I would agree that that is the case within the contemporary anarchist movement. There's a rejection of, if you were to ask, for example, your average like anarchist function in the United States in particular, but also other places, like who here believes in democracy, raise their hand. Who here believes in federalism, raise their hand. Who here believes in constitutions of some kind, raise their hand. A bunch of questions like that, you'll notice people won't raise their hand. And this isn't just definitional. I will note some of this might be that certain people are defining things in different ways, but if you actually substantially talk with them, they're actually going to be in agreement with some of these things. So some of it's definitional, a lot of it's substantial. So I would note that incoherence is real, and that's exactly why I personally broke with anarchism, despite being very influenced by Bookchin's critiques of it. I do think that when Bookchin critiques classical anarchism, he overstates the incoherence of the general movement. There is a lot of incoherence of the movement as a whole, especially with stuff on the fringes. But the general movement's, I think, a bit more coherent than that, because at least something like anti-socialism would never be a thing within the old anarchist movement. Whereas today, if you were to ask people at your average anarchist function, who here is in favor of socialism, you might get a lot of no hands raised, and not just for definitional reasons, but substantial reasons. Nonetheless, even that old anarchism has that hyper-pluralism in a sense, if we talk about it as the biggest possible tent, even within the most coherent definition, even that includes anti-organizational tendencies. So I would agree with the general thrust of that anarchism has that kind of incoherence to it. However, I would note the difference between the way that functions in the classical period and in like a contemporary United States context. And I think now that we have more and better translations internationally from this global movement that was mainly outside of Europe, that's hard to get translations for when Bookchin was writing on it. I think now that we're able to see that from this kind of vantage point, I do think we need to revise our conception of how incoherent classical anarchism was, for all of its limits, all of its faults, even some of its hierarchical tendencies, particularly patriarchal tendencies. Even all that stuff considered, there's a lot of coherence there nonetheless. But of course, we don't want to romanticize it. We need to note the falls and failings of even the classical anarchist movement, as well as contemporary anarchist movements that have made various advances in certain regards compared to classical anarchists in various fields. while at the same time not necessarily retaining the best stuff and some of the necessary stuff that were part of classical anarchism. Hopefully they had some good discussions. If anybody wants to raise any questions, critiques, things that people discuss, people are welcome to. For sake of time, it doesn't necessarily make sense to just do like mass summaries of breakout groups. So just bring up anything that anybody thinks is relevant, either from the breakout groups or not, for discussion. George.
Okay, I'm quite old. I'm 56. I've been in many movements on the left and near anarchism. I've even been involved in a few periodicals and journals. What people are saying is that they're not really accustomed with the terms of social ecology. Yeah. So maybe in the long run, there should be some kind of glossary presented to the participants, maybe next year. And also, people should start reading Bookchin's articles, the first articles, maybe a few of the articles Bookchin had wrote, or other people in the social ecology movement. Maybe there should be a database. Maybe a database should be created, and this could provide sufficient support to all these participants, even to other people who just are curious and want to see what is going on. For example, earlier on we were talking about dual power. Dual power is also a term used by Lenin. I mean, we have to talk about all these things, but there must be some kind of preparation before coming to the intensive. Thank you for your time. I will be leaving in a few minutes. I'll be back after 2. What time are we going to begin? 2-3 hours?
In 2 hours and 15 minutes, we're reconvening. Yeah, I like that idea a lot. I'll advocate for that. I think a glossary sounds like a really good idea. I think a lot of these terms are a bit complicated abstractions, but they're not that complicated. And once one has a term for it that's intersubjectively shared, it's possible to use these terms and explain pages of information within a single term potentially. And that allows really swift, rapid communication of these different concepts. And having a new term for something can sometimes help, carve out some new possibility or thing to look at. So I think that's a really good idea. I think that's good. And also it makes it so we don't have to do as much analytic work in terms of just defining necessary features of certain things, so we can get into more of the critical analysis and evaluation and how to go forward in regards to those terms. I'm going to advocate for a glossary next time. Thank you for that. Any other people want to get on stack? Well, until then, I can read out something that Laura wrote about how her concern was not just about a universal guaranteed safety net, but also universal unconditional rights that cannot be overridden. Yeah, I agree with that. I think that's really crucial. It's one of those necessary but insufficient features, is not just democracy, but also certain guaranteed minimal universal rights for people.
Yeah, I just added something actually as an addendum to that, which is that obviously the overarching system that I'm describing of there needing to be universal unconditional rights and provisions, some sort of social safety net, guaranteed no matter what, would have to be decided upon, created and decided upon collectively by all the communities by consensus, and also fluid enough that there could be later revisions, again, decided upon by consensus by all the communities, if circumstances changed and they needed to update something. But I mean, the main point is that there needs to be some sort of balance between universal and guaranteed. And then on the other hand, obviously always coming from the grassroots up, never from the top down.
Well, I agree with the universal rights framework. I disagree that consensus necessarily needs to be the only way through which that's decided upon. And I agree it does need to be decided upon collectively and democratically. I would also note that there's also certain principles where, irrespective of if a majority or if a consensus or if an individual believes or doesn't believe in certain individual rights or universal rights that should exist not just for individuals, but also for communities and groups, that certain guaranteed freedoms should exist no matter what, even if people aren't yet agreeing with them. But then the goal of us needs to then be to popularize good sets of such freedoms that are then universalized. Otherwise, they won't exist in any meaningful way. And there's no way to coerce that from a minority position, to say the least. So
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I strongly agree with you about this. And I'm just wondering if you can kind of walk us through the practical steps of how something like that would be created and enforced without violating the whole system of everything being done through collective decision-making and consensus and all the rest of it.
Yeah, well, it would come through groups that use direct democracy and participatory decision-making to then institute direct democracy and participatory decision-making as a development. So it uses that form to create that content, it develops it over time, it multiplies it, and it federates outward as it makes sense to then have certain guaranteed minimum that exists for all. And that guaranteed minimum, including the rights to the means of production, including the rights to the means of existence, including the rights to the means of participatory politics, right? Wherever they go, all of these different kinds of things are really important. Guaranteed freedoms that are far beyond liberal conceptions thereof, that go right into something that is rooted in the abolition of any ruling class and strata and the expression of participatory activity of both collectives and individuals. Collectives can then make decisions within such bounds, and then individuals can have participatory activity, how they relate to those collectives making those decisions. Mm-hmm. But such participatory of individuals is then not to then break the guaranteed freedoms of other people, right?
Right.
That would be distinct. Okay, yeah.
So Phil, I think maybe Leah had a question earlier.
Oh, sorry, Leah, I think you missed it.
Am I mute or unmuted?
You're not muted, go for it.
Ah, okay, fine. Phil, I was saying in our breakout session that for me and for maybe several others down south, we're far away, I'm in Australia, it's 2 o'clock in the morning. You were sort of talking to the uninitiated, and I was wondering how you could present your story perhaps to others who aren't part of the group, part of the lingo. It felt very much like you were speaking to a small group of mates who understand your language, and a lot of cheering on the sides. And also you were reading when I feel that if it's passionate and you're really concerned and really involved, you will speak to me directly. I can read your material later on. I just wondered how you could convey this in a more concrete way, maybe with some stories, case studies that would bring it home to, I know you were talking theoretically and more abstract. I'm an anthropologist. I work on the ground, and I'm interested in knowing how theories apply to reality. And that is basically what I was looking for. I mentioned in our breakout group that I work in Indonesia, and there's 17,000 islands and many different communities, and they're very communal. There's a very grassrootsy type atmosphere there, every village being very different from every other village. And the centralized government is really imposed through the colonial system. So it's natural to have some sort of anarchic system there. It is relevant, but I wanted to apply it to the ground, as it were. So that's probably my comment. That a lot of the language was like, I think this idea of translating the language into words is good, but it's also great when you present to make it more, for me anyway, for more practical, more down to earth, more relatable to a situation. Stories which illustrate what you're saying.
Yeah, so I guess first off, I would love to just be able to orate that entire spiel. The reason I was using notes was particularly so I would get some of the details correct and not misspeak around some of those details. I wanted to be precise in certain language, but also because I've had about 2 hours of sleep. So I didn't want to go completely off notes as much as I usually would like to because of that, to say the least. But also, I did try to define terms in the beginning to help with that, but you're completely right. I was using tons of abstractions the entire time. And I am in large part speaking to people I kind of thought the audience have, since they've been through this intensive and likely even before this intensive, have dabbled in some of these theories and practices, that this audience would generally be able to pick up on most of what I'm saying at least, and then the defining terms would then help to round that out. But this stuff needs to be communicated in many ways to many people in different styles. There's no uniform way to do that. Personally, I actually like the more abstract way of speaking and whatnot because of the way that these different terms like socialism, anarchism, what have you, are able to carve out so much with so little, and it enables such a swift kind of communication of certain kinds of ideas that might otherwise take paragraphs to do groundwork for. But you're totally right that there needs to be many different ways of communicating this stuff, and certainly the way I'm communicating it is far from universal or like the only way that should be done or anything like that. It's just one way of communicating these different ideas, and there's many different other styles that are awesome. And yeah, I definitely encourage people to find ways to speak that are not just to in-group, for sure. We have to find one big issue for sure is translating socialism, anarchism, communism, communalism, what have you, to people who are uninitiated. And it's a crucial thing that we need to be doing and developing with our language. But we also need to note that in different contexts, I think we can have different ways of communicating, right? Like if I know I'm talking with an audience that knows some of these abstractions, I can kind of fire them off rapid fire in a way where it's going to be very comprehensible. But in other contexts, that's going to be less than communicative. It's going to be counter-communicative, right? It's just going to confuse things and obfuscate things. So I think that it's contingent and conditional a bit about how we communicate these things. But I would note that there's different contexts where the kind of way I'm communicating, I hope, has some merit and value.
Thank you.
Would anyone else like to get on stack before we wrap things up? I do see one thing. Tristan asked in chat, are there any examples of this method of organizing popular assemblies in rural regions? It is my understanding that many of the experiments have focused in centers of relative density, which only helps the ability of people to meet face to face. That is a great question. Yes, there are many examples of rural areas that have organized this way. In fact, many of the revolutions that I mentioned are in rural regions, right? So like the first Zapatista revolution that I mentioned, the Morelos Commune, that's in a largely rural, like basically completely rural region, right? And not just that, the Free Territory also is dealing with a majorly agrarian context. And additionally, Rojava has largely agrarian context, and the Neo-Zapatista revolution has a largely agrarian context. So I think that there are many examples of that, and there's many other groups too. Like there's groups like the Rural Organizing Project within the context of the United States that do rural organizing in the context of this really racist society in such a way to counter a lot of racism and white supremacist tendencies that emerge not just in rural regions, but in certain concentrated rural regions in particular in the United States. So there are ways to organize in rural regions, even in terrible places like racist parts of like specifically some of the most racist parts of the United States. There's ways to do leftist organizing there in assemblies in a way that counters those racist and white supremacist tendencies. But also just broadly in rural contexts, yeah, it's totally possible. There's many examples of that, and some of the best revolutionary examples we have are from them. Anissa, and I think this will be the last one.
Cool. I've been trying to work out how to say this out loud in a coherent way, because as Leah said, it's almost 2 a.m. here, so I'm sorry it doesn't come across well, but I've been thinking a lot about what you said about consensus, and maybe I have a different definition, because I always get really like, oh, when people say, oh, nah, consensus, because to me, the like consent, like the whole, anytime that we say we don't need consensus for something, then that leads to oppression. And it also leads to, like, I think a lot in terms of consensus mentality, rather than like, people often think of consensus of everyone has to agree, but I think we can conceptualize it a lot broader into coming together in a way where it's like, we don't, instead of coming in with, I want this to happen, we come in with, these are my values and these are my needs and these are my ideas. And then with good facilitation, which there are endless epic practices of how to do it with hundreds, thousands, you know, online, offline, there's heaps of cool shit. So people always get freaked out when it's like, you can't have a meeting of 1,000 people or even more. We need to practice that. But yeah, like if people come in not just wanting to get their way, then there's so much potential. And so if instead of just saying things like, oh no, not consensus, like opening up that conversation more, because for me, and also the idea of voluntary association and standing aside, and consensus doesn't mean that everybody agrees, it means that everybody's okay with it. And I think Graeber puts it even better, like everyone's not violently opposed to it. As I think he might have been talking about Rojava or something. So it's not something where someone's going to go and create violence to stop. And so to me, in consensus in that way, people can stand aside, people can leave the group, people can say, I don't think this is a good idea, but I'm not going to get in your way. So I don't know. I think sometimes people say that you need people to be vaguely on the same side for this to happen. But for me, it's so important. End of rant.
Thank you for that. So here's how I'd respond to that. One, I'm not universally opposed to consensus systems. I think that they make sense in certain contexts, right? That depends. Different groups can self-manage in different ways. And there's many ways to use consensus that make a lot of sense. I don't think it's the only way to do direct democracy, though, and I think especially on a confederation level, it leads to issues, especially if that confederation's on a larger scale. One thing I would note is you can have consent without consensus. You can have free activity of each and all without needing to have everybody agree to every collective decision that is made every single time, where any one person in any context can veto any collective decision for whatever reason. There's ways to have that work out. So that's what I would advocate for, is the free activity of each and all in conjunction with direct democracy, in tandem as well with these universal rights of free participation of all and the means thereof, the means of existence, the means of production, etc. And because those universal rights don't get violated, then persons' minimal freedoms won't be violated by the group decision to the degree that that is actually upheld. And I think in that sense, people can find ways to live with majority decisions that they disagree with, even extremely disagree with and think are really stupid or unstrategic or what have you, while still retaining all of what should be their minimal guaranteed freedoms and free participatory activity in what they do in their life in regards to labor, work, and action that they do. So all of that is compatible, and that's what I would advocate. Instead of absolute unanimity, there's these other dimensions that I think can cover a lot of what people are trying to achieve with consensus without having to try to forge unanimous agreement between people for every single collective decision. And people can still retain their individual participatory activity and expression within such a structure. And I think that helps solve a lot of the concerns about non-consensus democracy in regards to the very real potential of people oppressing other people. And I would say that that potential also exists within consensus systems where you have this problem of every single person having far too much power to veto group decisions in a way that can lead to all sorts of issues. And when it comes to the stand aside stuff, there's all sorts of ways people can be intimidated or whatnot to stand aside. And one thing I don't like about consensus culture actually is the way it can turn every possible preference I have or idea into an imposition onto others, right? I would like to sometimes be able to express my preference, my ideas. I think this makes more sense than this. I would like to be able to do that without every time that's expressed and proposed, that being an imposition on everybody else, where now that's like my way or the highway and I can veto everything that disagrees with it potentially, right? So I think all that stuff's really important as ways to round out democracy, to make it so it's a libertarian, socialist, ethical system, right? It's this necessity and insufficiency of democracy is kind of what I'm getting at. We are 4 minutes over, but I believe Roberto had one thing on stack. So Roberto, go, and then we'll close some stuff up, eh?
Roberto, you muted.
I live in a red state, so I have to deal with a lot of people that are not familiar with all of these books and terms. So this is one of the reasons I developed my seminar on digital values. But it's also because I think it's so important that we are clear on our values on every level. And I think it's important that we see we need to be part of an ethical movement, as Murray keeps pointing out. And ethics are grounded in values. And I want to help people because I realize that so many people come into the movement still carrying all kinds of capitalist values and totally unaware that they are carrying them because they don't even know what they are. So I'm trying to help bring clarity to movements that are just starting out. That's why I offer my seminar to anyone that wants me to come. I have a partner that's starting to work with me. And I don't charge a single cent. I just want help with travel and have a place to lay my head at night. I'm not doing this for the money. I'm doing it because it's my responsibility to pass on whatever knowledge that I have gained to other people. And I think this is important knowledge because it's the basis of every movement. It's the foundation of everything that we do is based on our values. So I want to offer that to everyone. And if you have an organization or if you have like a university that's willing to pay for it, that you can spread it around. Because it's so important, to answer Martin Luther King's call for a radical revolution of values. Because if you have that revolution of values, that's the beginning of a revolution. And that's making sure that the revolution has good values so it has a better chance of succeeding. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Roberto. And if you want to post later on, I guess, in the closing session, a link for people to get that kind of mutual aid, popular education with you, please do that. Thank you, everybody. This has been grand. Thanks for all of the questions. And I will see y'all at the closing session.